So working with effects in InDesign, as I said, work in similar ways and also not from other Adobe products. They're kind of buried depending on how you want to choose them. There is an effects window in InDesign, so we can open up that palette, which to me, it has some handy features, and I'm trying to open it wider and it's not letting me. We'll throw it over here. As I zoom in, you will see it kind of has a similar, for those of you again that are used to Illustrator and things like that, I feel like by default, it kind of has your appearance from your appearance panel from Illustrator. Information. So you see you have, let's select an object here. So it'll have your object, the opacity, the blending mode, which we'll get into as you click on here. This is something from Photoshop. It also works in Illustrator. It allows you to blend whatever object that you're applying it to with whatever's underneath it, essentially. So it allows you to sort of create a little bit more seamless blends and sort of visual effects. So you have a whole bunch of different screen modes, which I'll show you in a little bit. Your opacity settings here, and it will tell you what kind of stroke, what kind of fill, and any effects that you apply here. And you also have your list here that you can click under that handy little FX button. So you can apply, my mouse is stuck, you can apply a bunch of different effects there. You can also get to effects under object. So if you have an object selected, like we do here, you have that same list. It's the same exact thing as doing it from your effects palette as well. It's just in the drop down. There's another way to do it. So generally when you apply anything in InDesign, it's generally under object, because if you think about effects, you're affecting the object. Whereas like I know in Adobe, I keep saying InDesign, in Illustrator and in Photoshop, it has its own panel under, I forget whatever it is. It might even have an effects drop down. I can't remember off the top of my head. So you'll see for me, I always have to think about it and go, yeah, oh, it's under object since you're affecting the object. Or you can open your effects palette, which is already open here, and you have your object selected, and you can open your panel from there. So I just wanted to show you those basics very quickly first. So we'll go over some of the effects. You can apply them to just about anything. There's certain things that won't apply to text, so you need to outline your text first, which I'll get into. But for example, let's say we wanted to put a drop shadow on this text. Now I know we talked about drop shadows earlier with some of the magazine layout things, where we put a solid background. Like let's say this is white text, and we can put a black drop shadow behind it just by copying and pasting behind and knocking it over a couple and knocking it down a couple to give like more of a solid drop shadow. With the effects, it works more like raster effects, where you can get a little bit more sort of photorealistic, I guess, effects. So you see here, when you get to your effects palette, you choose your effect, and it opens this second window here, where you have all these different effects that you can apply. You can apply them all at once if you'd like to. It might freak out a little bit, but when you select your drop shadow here, you have a variety of options. So you have your blending mode, again, which we'll get into. You can have screen. For the most part, unless it's actually over something, a lot of this will look the same since it's on a white background. So we'll just leave it as normal. You can set the opacity, so you can have a really nice light shadow if you want. You can set the distance. Let's say we want our distance at, and I have my increments set to points, so I'm typing in inches. So we have 1/8 of an inch You can set the angle either by dragging around your angle circle, or you can type in, I'll put it about where it was. You can type in the angle too if you know you want to have a 45 or a negative 45, et cetera, et cetera. The offsets is how far it offsets from the object. So we'll drop it back a little bit. So you can have a nice subtle drop shadow or a little bit of a wider drop shadow. Another handy feature is you can use global light. So if you click this box, what it will do is it will set one essentially light source for your entire document. So that way, if you threw a drop shadow on here, like let's say for argument's sake, this is a little bit more of an advanced illustration rather than boxes and text, right? If you had a little bit more of an advanced illustration and you had this drop shadow, one drop shadow going this way, and then another drop shadow right next to it going the other way, like obviously physically that doesn't make sense because you would have two different light sources. So if you wanted to use the same light source throughout your document, you could if you were trying to do a little bit more realistic lighting effects. If that doesn't matter to you, like with a magazine layout, if you're just kind of putting the drop shadow where it highlights your text a little bit more, whichever works better, then you can uncheck global light. But that is handy to, again, keep essentially one light source or keep your light source the same throughout a document. A couple of different other options. You have your size, and this is where it can kind of get, let's go back up to 75 so we can actually see it. This is where it takes a little bit of playing around with the size, size, spread, and noise. So the size, as you kind of see, is essentially how big the shadow is, obviously. But you'll see it kind of softens it a little bit if you think about it. And this is where you would play around with your spread. So as you get, larger with your spread and your size, if you wanted the size of your drop shadow to be pretty large, you could play with the spread. And that's kind of how far your shadow sort of like feathers out on all sides. It takes a little bit of playing around with the size and the spread to sort of get the hang of it if you want it to be a little bit more realistic. But basically the size essentially makes your drop shadow a little bit bigger, but what it ends up doing optically, it kind of feathers and softens your drop shadow a bit more than if your size is, let's go really small, as you can see. Like if you go really small, it's a much tighter drop shadow. And even if we brought the spread out, you can see it just makes it a bit larger, but it's still like a very tight drop shadow. So if we went back to our size, went up to 2 points, you can see it really softens out. It softens out that shadow. I think really what the size technically kind of refers to is how, if you think about it sort of as I'm guessing like how far your light source is, right? So I think unless I'm doing this to a scientist, is probably going to tell me I'm wrong. But if the light source is like further away, like your shadow is going to be a little bit softer, right? I feel like they always could have come up with a better word than size to describe that. But you get the idea. You'll see as you play around with it a little bit. As you play around with it, you'll just sort of get the hang of it. Other options, which we'll get into, so we can hit OK. You can also choose a color too if you want to choose different colors. And again, colors work the same way. It just has our default swatches here. We want to choose a red shadow, green, our CMYK. You can also get into your sliders to play around with it a little bit, get a little bit more custom with your RGB, CMYK, or lab, or your swatches. And again, if you added any swatches to your swatch palette like we did earlier in the semester, they'll show up here. So you can change your drop shadow colors and we'll hit OK. Or we won't hit OK because I want to go through a couple other ones. Other effects, so I'm going to uncheck that so that we no longer see it. You can do an outer glow, which is similar. It handles in a similar way to drop shadowing. You'll see, I'm going to make it red just so we can see it. You have a couple different options here, softer or precise. Generally, I tend to leave it as soft because if you want to have an outer glow, like generally it's kind of like a soft outer glow. It's kind of like a drop shadow that doesn't have an angle, if that makes sense. Like it's a nice sort of soft kind of shadowing effect, but it's around the entire, so it goes from the middle out. It goes from the middle out of your object, so it's around the entire outline. Obviously, it's an outer glow, so it goes around the entire outline of your object instead of being like offset like a drop shadow would be. But again, you have similar features. You can play around with the size and the spread. You can also add noise if you want, which kind of like pixelates it a bit. It adds digital noise, so you can have that kind of funkier digital noise look. Change the colors, change the opacity. An inner glow is basically the same. Here we'll leave it at white. We'll make the size a little bit, but you can kind of see. Let's change the color to yellow. See if that helps. You can kind of see it's glowing. It's doing a similar thing, but it's glowing from the edges of your object towards the middle. So it's giving you sometimes a 3D look, but it's giving you an inner glow. And again, you can have it start from the edge in or the center out. And here's where you would play with your size to give you the desired effect. And you have similar, let's type in 1/8 of an inch. Similar options as with the drop shadows and with the inner glow and outer glow, except they have a choke, which somewhat works the same way as the spread and the size, but you can kind of see, again, just through sort of trial and error and playing around with it. You can add noise again. I'll uncheck that. And I'll go through, this will be the last one, but you'll see the idea. We can play around with these at another point. So you have a bevel, which gives you a more 3D look. And again, you can have a couple of different, you can have it look outer, and that's going to depend on, with black on white, it doesn't look as great, but that's going to depend on the direction. It's going to give you more options for creating a bevel that looks like it's indented or coming out of an object. So you can have outer bevel, inner bevel, embossing, which is a little bit tighter, or a pillow emboss, which is a nice soft, sort of softer edge emboss, but it's a lot larger. So we'll just go on the outer bevel, and again, inner bevel rather. And again, you can play around with your size. You can soften your bevel a bit to give the edges a little bit of a softer look, right? I should have zoomed in a little bit just to see here. Let's zoom in a bit so you can actually see that. Let's go to our bevel and emboss. There we go. So now you can see that a little bit better. So if we brought the size down just a touch, softened it up a little bit, you can see it kind of softens your edges a bit. You can play around with the depth of the bevel, which if you think about this as like a carving, like that's exactly what it means, like how, essentially how deep the carving is. You can change the angle as well, and again, using global light if you wanted to keep your light source all the same. You can choose colors for your highlights and shadows as well. You also have blending modes for the types of shadows that you want. Generally, I tend to leave it as the default multiply, as it gives you the best, or generally gives you the best look, because you don't want too harsh of a light if you want it to look realistic anyway. And then you have opacity for both your highlights and your shadows. You could have the direction up or down, and that is going to also help to create whether the bevel, like if you think about it, Is it, you know, if it's a wall or a carving, let's say, is the text raised and carved away, or is it carved into whatever flat object it is? Again, obviously, black on white doesn't really give it a great great description, but you can see, you know, you can play around with these different options, and then you have satins, which allow you to sort of over black, it's not going to work at all, but allows you to sort of give a little bit of a color overlay, and allows you to kind of almost stain your objects, and then feathers and directional feathers, etc., etc. I won't go through all the options, but feathers kind of looks similar to an inner glow, but it's basically feathering the edges of your feathers the edges of your objects. Directional feathers allow you to just control more if you wanted it just to feather the top versus all around the object. And then lastly, gradient feathers somewhat act similarly to our gradients, but they're essentially feathering the object as a gradient would affect. To be honest, I tend not to use a gradient feather really at all. If I'm going to do something like this, like I'll generally just kind of do a gradient. That's not to say you wouldn't use it, but like I would just have a gradient fill rather than a gradient feather. If I'm going to feather it, if I'm going to feather something, like I would do something more like a basic feather or a directional feather. But if I was going to do a gradient feather or that gradient look, I feel like I would just have a gradient fill in there. But it's not to say that this doesn't have a purpose. I just personally haven't really found that purpose. But again, like all gradients, you can choose if it's a radial gradient or a linear gradient. You can change your angles. You can control your gradient with the color stops. And in this case, it goes to transparent, from black to transparent. You can change your color of your color stops as well. I believe you should be able to, or not. Why is it not allowing me to? Should be able to change your color stops. I don't know why it's not allowing me to, but anyway. But again, usually 9 times out of 10, I'm going to use a gradient fill rather than a gradient feather there. So I'm just going to cancel that. So those are essentially the basic sort of raster effects that you can apply to objects and text. And again, they can be accessed either through your FX button here, or again, object, effects, if you don't have your effects window open. I'll go into some other simple effects that you can apply to objects, to either frames or shapes. When you are selecting objects, I'm not sure if you guys had noticed or not. If you didn't, no big deal. There's this little yellow box that pops up when you select an object in InDesign. And what that is, it's essentially your corner widget in Illustrator, if you guys are familiar with that. So you click this once to access your corner widgets, and you'll see you have 4 yellow, I'm like pointing at my screen like you can see it, 4 yellow diamonds, I guess, at the edges of your object, right? And what this allows you to do is you can drag these in a bit, and you can create a round corner. If you were to, you can see they all move together, so they automatically default to having those sort of dimensions locked. If you hold, I always forget which one it is. Why isn't it working? I always forget which modifier key it is. Not option. Uh-oh.
Sorry.
It's all right. There we go. If you hold shift before you move the corner widget, so if you hold shift and drag a corner, you'll see now you can just drag one corner independently from the others. So now you can have like one rounded corner. And then again, hold shift if you wanted to have this sort of I'm just kind of arbitrarily doing it. But if you wanted to have this kind of look, as opposed to dragging them all together, you just hold Shift again and then move your corner widgets. I'm going to undo that. So we can drag our corner widgets in a bit. And then you'll see, as you'll see here, when you get into your object options, there's a couple different ways, of course, to do to select corner widgets. You can have a rounded, an inverse rounded, an inset, bevel, fancy. I always get a kick out of fancy. So fancy. And again, you can adjust these by dragging your corners, your corner widgets there. You can also hold Option and click through is another way to click through your options. I believe also if we hold, if we hold Shift and Option, you could have theoretically, there we go, 4 different corners if you wanted to. I don't know why you would do that, but you can have 4 different corners if you really wanted to. So that's holding Shift and Option. Again, Shift to isolate one corner widget, and then Option as you click through to click through the different corners. And these can be applied to just about any object with corners. And then as you see, as you click off and then click back onto the object again, now the yellow square is back here. So again, to access those corner widgets, you need to click on that yellow square that pops up there, and then you get your corner widgets are active again. If you do have multiple settings, I guess, I don't know if it's going to default to go back. No. If you had different, just to show you, I'm going to hold down Shift to isolate this one. So let's say like this is obviously a lot smaller than this inset, right? So let's say you had different insets as well as different corners. If you go back and change without holding Shift, you'll see now it affects all of them, and now we get this crazy funky shape. So you just have to remember that if you did isolate one and you want to change it, you have to remember to go back and hold Shift to sort of re-isolate it, which I do all the time. I always forget, and then I have to undo and whatever. I guess that's why I have an undo button. So I'm not necessarily sure why this is in the effects chapter, but I feel like it should be in the frames chapter. But anyway, so it's another way to give you a little bit more sort of advanced graphic techniques. And you can also apply effects to these. So if you had, let's say, a drop shadow, you'll see it applies a drop shadow in the same shape as your corners, or an inner shadow as well, maybe, or an inner glow. Well, the inner glow is going to be a little bit weird because it's a stroke, but anyway, you get the idea. You can apply most of these effects to the objects. I'm going to cancel this, and then not necessarily lastly, but and again, I'm not sure why this is in the effects chapter, but another somewhat advanced technique we can do is you can also create stroke styles. I know, pretty sure we worked on that earlier in the semester. We looked at like creating dashed lines and things like that. Oh yeah, with the witch, the last thing, the witch thing, with the type and the starts and the ends and all that fun stuff. Under stroke type, under our stroke styles in our contextual button here, brings up our stroke style options. You can create a new stroke style, and it'll preview here. You can create new dash styles, or in this case, a new stripe style. So what this is going to do, basically, this is a very zoomed in look at the edge here, right? So what the default will do is it'll create a stripe at the top, a space. Well, if we're looking at this here, stripe at the top, a space, and then a stripe at the bottom. So if you wanted to do, like in one of our assignments, for example, like let's say you wanted to do something thin, you can adjust. You see these arrows here. You can adjust the sizes. I'm just going to go there. You can also set. So let's say we wanted these to be about 10 from the top and then 10 from the bottom. You can set your start and your start and end. You can also add a middle stripe. Let's say we want to have a thick middle stripe. You just click anywhere on your sidebar here, and you'll see we have a super, super thin line here. And then you can just kind of arbitrarily drag it down. And then you can set your, let's do 25. You can set your start and your width here. So we'll bring it down to 75-ish. Let's start that at 50, 25. There we go. So now we have, it's right in the middle there. And then what you're basically going to do, you can name it. So we'll call it, I don't know, 3, or you can call it whatever you want. Thin, thick, thin, whatever. And then we're going to hit OK twice, essentially. So we're going to hit OK, and then that adds it here. And then we're going to hit OK again to close that stroke style. And now, under your type here, at the very bottom, you have your user-created stroke styles. And you can bring the weight up. And now you've created a stroke style. Again, I'm not sure why this was not in the graphics portion and it's in the effects portion, but you get the idea. So somewhat practical applications for these things. Let's say we wanted to do, for this is again part of the assignment that we're going to be going to. Let's round these corners a bit. Oh, why didn't it do that one? That's strange. Okay, let's round, there we go. Let's round these corners in a bit. All right, and let's say we want to add our effects. We'll add a drop shadow. I'm going to tighten up that distance a little bit. And then I'm also going to add an inner shadow. In the top corner here, you can kind of see it right there. I'll bring that distance in just a touch there too, just to sort of do this. So you'll see now in our effects palette, when we select an object, now you'll see that there's effects applied, as it says, effects applied to the object, drop shadow and inner, and you can drag to another frame or another object to apply it to an object instead of having to go back and remember what it'll sort of remember what you last did. But if you've changed things or if you've done anything, it's sort of a way to save or to make sure you have the same instead of doing it to all of them at once, which can be kind of tricky. You can apply the effect simply by dragging that effect to the objects, so it'll apply that, the actual effects. So it'll apply that inner shadow and that drop shadow that we have. The corner widgets, it will not, because technically that's not an effect. So the corner widgets, you'll have to, you know, make sure you have them about the same 1 inch on all of them. Which is again why I don't understand why it's the corner widgets wasn't in a different chapter. But so applying effects, like I said, if you had one effect on something and you really liked it and wanted to apply it to a different object. Again, you select that object that has the effect, and you grab that FX, and you'll see you get that little plus sign, and now we've just added it to our yellow box. So it's a nice handy way to be able to sort of copy effects from one object to another. Lastly, I will show you blending modes. So I know we talked about it a little bit, but blending modes, why isn't this? There we go. I wanted to zoom in a little bit. Again, this is sort of a piece of one of our assignments, so I wanted to kind of walk you through it a little bit. In our layers here, what we're going to do is we're not really going to be playing around with these crazy bright colors. What we're going to be doing is playing around with the blending modes of this super awesome vintage portrait. So under our effects, you'll see we have the blending mode is normal, and the opacity is 100. So if we go to multiply, what this allows you to do, and I'll move it, unless there's something under it with multiply, unless there's something under it, it basically allows whatever is underneath these objects. I kind of wanted it to, there we go. Whatever's underneath the object kind of shows through in a variety of different ways through your blending modes. Basically what it does is it blends the layer you're affecting it, you're putting the effect on, it blends it with whatever is behind it. And there's a variety of different modes. Like, so what they're going to do is have you walk through, you know, a screen is going to kind of give it a little bit of a different feel. I'll do it with the same, you know, it's going to kind of give you a different feel than the others. And you'll see you have an overlay. Oops, I picked the wrong thing. There we go. Pick the actual photo instead of the frame. You want to make sure that you're picking your photo. So an overlay, and you can see they have, you know, fairly subtle, but they have different effects: soft light, hard light, color dodge, or color burn. And you'll see like the color of that green come through in a variety of different ways. This one actually blended pretty well. It just kind of gave you a little bit more of a green tint. You can lighten it. So you can create a variety of different effects. Yikes. A variety of different effects by using your, let's go back to overlay, using your blending modes. And you can also play with the opacity as well. And what this can allow you to do, except for making this sort of Warhol-y kind of look, what this allows you to do when you're working with an illustration is it will allow you to sort of blend two different or multiple, multiple things to where you can have, like, if you wanted, for example, I was working on this before, like if you want to do a mock-up of a logo on a coffee cup, and you're in either Illustrator or InDesign, you select the logo that's over an image or an illustration of the coffee cup, and then you can change your blending modes, and it'll allow the different blending modes, and playing with the opacity will allow, you know, the coffee cup to sort of show through the logo, so you can actually make it look like it's printed instead of just having it placed on top in the sort of vector or raster format. It allows you to sort of make a little bit of a more seamless illustration, which is generally like the practical use that I use it for, is sort of creating that look to where you have that blending mode, and again allowing the bottom object to show through a little bit. And you can have it be as subtle or as, you know, if you wanted it to look more like a vintage stamp print, for argument's sake. Let's say, let's go back to like hard light, or even any of these. If you wanted it to have sort of like a vintage stamp look, you can kind of play around with, obviously with a photo and just a solid color, it's going to be a little bit different, but you get the idea. You can play with the different types of overlays, and again, if there's nothing behind it, it's not going to look it's not going to really look any different, because it has to be over an object to have that object underneath show through that blending mode.